Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to church here. It's so glad to have you here in worship and joining us online. You may notice today that we are shifting back to an entirely live service, which is really exciting because we've got a few folks in the sanctuary with us helping us prepare for next week's opening. And I'm just really glad that you've taken some time to join us. I haven't introduced myself. My name is Chris Abel. I'm our lead pastor. And if you're joining us for the first time, I hope you take a moment to fill out one of our connection cards online. You can see it in the description or on the comments somewhere on this page. And so we just love to know that you are worshiping with us. And so now, gathered together, we invite you to join us in this moment of worship.
Well, welcome this morning. We want to invite you that are here with us. We've got at least a row full of brewers here, so you can imagine what that looks like at home. We want to invite you to stand with us, and the rest of you at home, please join along.
You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born again into your family. Your blood flows through my veins, and I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God.
There's nothing worth more that will ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, where my heart becomes free and my shame is undone. In your presence,
Holy Spirit, you are welcome here.
come flood this place into the atmosphere. Your
Glory, God, is what our hearts long for, to be overcome by your presence, Lord.
Your presence,
There's nothing worth more that could ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope.
your presence.
I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves,
Where my heart becomes free and my shame is undone. Your presence,
Holy Spirit, you are welcome here.
come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. Your glory, God, is what our hearts long for, to be overcome by your presence, Lord. Your presence, Lord. Your presence. Oh God, how we love your presence, Lord. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. Let us become
be seated. And friends, I invite you now to join me for this time of prayer. Creator God, we're just so grateful that you've brought us together from wherever we are. And God, right now it feels like in our world that there's so much going on, that there's so much divisiveness, so much polarity, that there's so many pointing fingers. And God, sometimes being a Christian in the midst of all of this can be so confusing because there's all of these voices, all of these pressures pulling us in different directions. And so God, we just ask you this morning to help clear the air, to help us have some space and some margin to truly be able to hear your voice above all of the other voices, and to have some instruction, some guidance, and about how to be a person who lives like you live, how to be like Christ in the midst of all of this. God, you know that right now there's a lot of people that the word Christian is a negative association, and so God, help us be people who take back that label. And God, you know that right now in the midst of those who are sitting here and those who are at home on our couches or watching on the cell phone somewhere on a computer, God, you know everything that's going on in our lives and you know the struggles we face. And so we just take a moment and we lift up quietly the needs in our life. And we ask for your help wherever it is that we need some help in our lives. And God, we also take a moment to realize that we fall short, that we sin, that maybe we had an outburst, or we said or did something that we shouldn't have. God, that we struggle with some things in our lives, that there are sins underneath the surface that are maybe invisible to everyone else, but or maybe it's just visible to everyone. And so, God, we just take a moment to confess, to clear the air, to ask for your help in the places where we need to change in our own lives. God, we're so grateful that you sent your Son to walk with us, to lead us, to love us. And so we close this prayer by remembering the prayer that he taught us as we say together, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. And now I want to invite Megan to come on up, and she's got some announcements for us to share about what's going on in the life of the church. Come on up.
Good morning, church. I am very excited to be with you this morning, and happy Father's Day to all those fathers out there. I want to take a moment and tell you about some exciting things in the life of our church. First of all, this Saturday, we're having a socially distanced drive-in movie. We'll be watching the Pixar movie Onward, and it's 100% free. There'll be snacks for purchase, though. But there's going to be limited spots, so make sure you grab one before they're gone. By the way, the word on the street is that Pastor Andrew, our new pastor coming to us, will be making an appearance that night. So come by and say hello and register online at bluespringsumc.org. Secondly, if you have little ones, we're offering a hybrid vacation Bible school. Every Tuesday night in July, you'll have the opportunity to join your kids for a socially distanced hour-long VBS party and lesson here at the church. Then we'll send you home with VBS goodie bags to keep the fun going all week. And you can register, again, on our website by clicking the link on our homepage. Lastly, next week, we are actually going to have the opportunity to regather in the sanctuary. Yay! We're anticipating a lot of folks joining us from home, but you're still ready to join us, and be cautious about that. We invite you to sign up on our website and reserve your spot. We do have some precautions in place, and we're testing them this weekend, so that way you can find your way and enjoy us back in the sanctuary. So call our office or check the link on our website. That's all I've got, but you can find all the other information in our digital bulletin available in the comments or the details. Thanks.
Hello, church family. We are the Cruises. Today's scripture reading is from Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 4.
So every single one of you who judge others is without any excuse. You condemn yourself when you judge another person because the one who is judging is doing the same things.
If you judge those who do these kinds of things while you do the same things yourself, think about this. Do you believe that you will escape God's judgment?
Or do you have contempt for the riches of God's generosity, tolerance, and patience? Don't you realize that God's kindness is supposed to lead you to change your heart and life?
This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Well, good morning, everyone. Hello again. And that has to be one of the cutest scripture readings I think I've ever seen. I've never heard the word judgment said so cutely before. Well, I'm glad that you're here with us and joining us for our message today. We are in our sermon series called Breathe. And if you're just joining us, and this is the first time that you've heard this series, or maybe you've been on vacation or down at the lake, or your internet broke or something. But if you're just joining us for this series, don't worry. This is not a series on yoga or breathing techniques or meditation. We are actually talking about what peace looks like for Christians, what peace looks like for Christians in our lives, and how that looks differently than maybe the peace that, as Jesus says, the world offers. And so each week we've been taking a look at advice from the Apostle Paul in his letter that he wrote to the first Christians in Rome. And he wrote advice because they didn't have a New Testament. They didn't have church tradition. They were figuring out what it meant to be Christian. And he gave them advice about what this looks like. And so in our first week, we talked about how peace does not come from just lack of conflict, that peace comes from following God's Spirit and where it might be taking you. And then in the second week, we talked about how peace comes from knowing our place, and how Christians have this unique view of the world that says, hey, we are extremely small in this big world, but also we are extremely special, and we have to walk that line. And when you can put your problems and your stresses in perspective, it can help you have a peace that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have. And this week, I want to talk about a really, really specific obstacle to inner peace. And I mean really, really specific. So specific that if I had you imagine your greatest obstacles to peace, I very much doubt that this one would come to mind. However, it's a big one. It's a big obstacle, and it is everywhere. Not only is it everywhere, but it is celebrated. It is seen as a source of strength, not an obstacle to peace. And that huge, sneaky obstacle is your need to be right. Your need to be right. And I see some nodding here in the sanctuary, and perhaps you feel like you're nodding at home. Or you might be saying, whoa, Pastor Chris, I don't have a need to be right. I just happen to be right all the time. I would have no problem admitting fault. It's just that I don't need to. This is the world that I find myself in. And if that's you, I'm really happy for you. But you know who I'm even more happy for? Is your family and friends. Because it must be a delight to know you. And it must be so helpful for them to realize that they've got a person in their life that always has the answers, that when they're wrong, that they can come to and have a solution, and to have your wisdom and insight and knowledge. And man, I'm so glad to know you too, and I need to know you better. But if that's not you, the rest of us, we live in a culture that celebrates having this exaggerated confidence, inflated egos, self-assurance, sticking to your guns attitude, and dismissing any other points that contradict your own as, have you heard the term fake news before? Like we just deny anything that we don't want to hear. This is the world that we live in right now. And we admire these traits, especially when they're the traits of somebody who agrees with our beliefs, don't we? However, we're talking about peace today. And by the time you leave here today or you turn off your screen, what I'm hoping is that you understand that this attitude of needing to be right is something that will steal peace from your life. If you're a Christian, this attitude is also incompatible with the Christian walk. This is not something that Jesus modeled for us. In fact, this was an obstacle to living like Jesus, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I really want to connect the dots here, and I don't want you to just take my word for it. And so I want to tell a story that seems really trivial, and it's really embarrassing, but it's a moment to illustrate this connection between having to be right and a lack of peace. And here's my story. So a few months ago, I realized that I left some money on the table with my cell phone provider. So I don't know if you guys ever do this. Maybe this is the millennial in me, but instead of calling them up, I just went to the chat window on the website, and I was like, I'm going to be tough through chat. And so I started talking to this customer service person, and for about half an hour, we went back and forth. I was taking screenshots of old promotions. They were sending me terms and conditions. I mean, it was like a battle of the typing fingers, I guess. And for about half an hour, this went on. And what's funny about this is I spent about half an hour typing this all out to try to get like $25 back that I thought that I deserved from my cell phone provider. And so what's funny is I'm such a cheapskate, and it comes in handy sometimes in my own life. It comes in handy when I'm, for instance, looking at the church budget and trying to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible here. Where it doesn't come in handy is when I'm willing to lose time in my day and ruin my entire day so I could possibly get $25 back from my cell phone company. That's when it's not helpful. And so I opened up this chat window, I started talking with them, and I was not my best self. At one point, I think the guy typed to me and he said something like, well, if you add up such and such, and I think I wrote back, I know how to do math. It wasn't my best moment. And I think the worst part was I was in the middle of writing a sermon on loving people. And so there was just this is probably not my best moment. This is why I'm a little embarrassed to share this. And so, but $25 was on the line. I mean, some of you know what I mean. And so after half an hour of this, I had the horrifying realization that he was making sense and that I had actually misunderstood something. And I remember feeling kind of the blood leave my face and thinking, oh no, I've been a jerk and I'm wrong. This is a terrible combination. And then in that moment, I don't know if any of you have ever felt this way, but I thought, okay, how do I get out of this? I feel trapped by what I've done in my own little situation here. So my first inclination was just to close the chat window and just run, right? And just not face it. My second inclination was just to double down and just, even though I realized I was wrong, to still fight for my $25 that I definitely did not earn. So I thought, well, maybe that way, because this is otherwise I have to kind of eat crow here. I have to be humble and own my mistake. And that didn't seem very fun, but then I thought, oh, okay, I have to get back to this sermon. If I don't do this, God's going to give me a horrible sermon this weekend. And so I had some incentive. So I typed back, and at first I said something like, okay, I see your point. Which is, I don't know, guys especially, I feel like sometimes this is our way of trying to apologize. We're like, yeah, okay, I'm kind of coming around. There's no apology. I'm not going to admit I was wrong. And then the closest I got that day, I think I said something like, all right, you're right. I hope that you have a good day. I'm sorry for being a pain in the butt customer. Please, I hope that you don't have any more of me's today. And then I logged off with my tail between my legs and kept writing my sermon. But I share this because I thought that was fascinating in this moment of, and I don't know if you guys are like this, but I feel whenever I have a moment like this, I feel physiological changes in my body. So here's an example. I felt my pulse rate went up when I was typing on this keyboard, right? My face flushed. My chest burned. I felt like an injustice happened because I wasn't getting my $25 credit. Cortisol and adrenaline pumped through my veins. all over $25 argument where I was still wrong. Like, this is, how funny is this? That even in the most minor of moments, that sometimes we have so much trouble being right that we will have physiological changes that will last all day. And I can guarantee you, if I had not backed down in that moment, for the rest of the day, I still would have been impacted by this. I would have, Beth would have come over and I would have had conversations with her, and I would have been a little less patient. I'd be a little more snappy, right? Because when your body gets like this, and when you feel that physical response, it's hard to rev down again. And so that would have happened to me. Any conversations or phone calls or work that I had to do, I would have been like fight or flight mode, because all of this was pumping through my veins, like all over a chat with a cell phone provider. And thankfully, I got one of the good customer service agents who patiently walked me through things. This blows my mind how much the stakes are when it comes to conflict, when it comes to admitting fault, when it comes to realizing that perhaps we're not right. And definitely, if I had not come to a place where I realized my mistake, I could not have had any peace for the rest of the day, at least. Now, ideally, I would have avoided the situation entirely if I had just known that I was wrong from the start. But I didn't know. I didn't know that I was wrong because I thought I was right. A few years ago, a buddy of mine was going through school to be a counselor, and he asked me this question that has stuck with me ever since. And he asked me this question right here. He said this: how does it feel to be wrong? Now, he was very patient with me. I responded, bad? Is that? And he said, well, okay, no, Chris, it actually, it's this. It feels like you're right. And I kind of sat there for a second, and I thought, is it? And he said, think about it. When you're wrong about something and you don't know you're wrong, there's no internal mechanism that tells you that you're wrong. When you are wrong, it feels the exact same as when you're right. They feel the same in your brain. And this, I think, we don't realize. This we're not taught. We think just because we feel we're right, that we're right. And so he unpacked this for me, and it was really helpful. And I realized something. By the way, here's another example. For my entire life, I thought that bachelor parties were for groomsmen. And I'm planning a board game bachelor party because I'm really a wild guy. And I always thought it was just for the groomsmen. I didn't realize you could invite other people to a bachelor party. And so I had to actually ask like 2 or 3 other people, and they informed me that was true my entire life. But there was nothing in my head that said, oh, Chris, this belief is probably wrong. No, it felt like that was accurate information, because when you're wrong, it feels like you're right. Right? It says being wrong feels like being right. This is one of the strangest things about our human brain, is that we can think we're right, and it feels like we're right, even if we're not. Now, this should make us second guess all of our strongest claims, because you might be willing to die on a hill that isn't true. Like, just because we feel strongly about something doesn't mean that it's necessarily correct, doesn't mean that it's right. And if you take one thing away today from today's message, I'd hope it was this: that feeling that something is right doesn't make it right. That your feelings alone are a bad measurement of if something is true. That this is the challenge of humans, right? For our entire civilization, there have been people who have lived and died, people who have killed, people who have stolen, people who have done, because something feels right. Emotions are a bad ruler, judge of what something is true or not. And this should make us pause. And this should make us careful. And this should make us slow to speak and eager to learn. And yet, most of us don't, and most of us won't. But good news, there's a reason why we have trouble seeing our wrongness and admitting fault. And it's even got a catchy name. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect. It's named after David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who developed a theory that the more incompetent someone is, the less likely that they'll know that they're incompetent. It's kind of a catch-22. The title of their original paper cracks me up. Listen to what they titled their original research paper. Unskilled and unaware of it. How difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence leads to inflated self-assessments, which is really wordy. I imagine when they're, I don't know if this was a PhD paper or something, can you imagine submitting this to a research magazine? Unskilled and unaware of it. It cracks me up, the title of this. So later on, they really got onto something, and there was a lot of movement, emotion, and support behind their studies. And later on, they performed an experiment with undergrad psychology students and had them take a test capturing their logical reasoning, grammar, and sense of humor. And I don't know exactly how you measure that last one. I'm sure I'd score really high. After learning their scores, this is a key thing, the students were asked to rank themselves and how they did compared to the rest of their class. And they found class after class that the lowest ranking students placed themselves far higher than they actually ranked. For example, students who ranked in the 12th percentile, which, man, that would be a little humbling, wouldn't it? Your humor is in the 12th percentile. Okay, and they said that they came in the 62nd percent. So the people who were at 12% thought they came in better than 2/3 of their classmates. Okay, and so here's how the researchers summed up the study. They said this: this overestimation occurs in part because people who are unskilled in these domains suffer a dual burden. Not only do these people reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices, so they're saying, yes, their first blow is that they're bad at things. The second is their incompetence robs them of the metacognitive ability to realize it. That they're so bad they don't even realize how bad they are, because you need to know enough to know that you're bad. This is not just with these psychology students. This happens everywhere in life. I think Bertrand Russell said in the 1930s, he says something along the lines of that it's the people who know the most who doubt themselves the most, and it's the people who know the least that are the most confident and boastful. And how funny is it that this is the world we live in, that those who know the most actually second guess their knowledge, and those who know the least are the ones who promote themselves as experts. Okay, so think about this, that the better you are at something, the more you realize how much you have to learn. Now, Beth's best friend is a doctor, and this gal, she is bright, and yet every time we talk about, we're hanging out or we have a medical conversation, she's the first person, and she doesn't hesitate at all to admit what she doesn't know. You know, she's the first person to send someone to a specialist. That's not really my specialty, even though she knows 10 times more about that topic than me, because she knows what she doesn't know. Think about it this way. The best teachers are able to say, I don't know, let me look into it. Right? It's those who are the most, it's the other teachers that have to always be right. Did you have this teacher? You caught them with something and then they couldn't admit any fault at all. The best mechanics I know which cars they know well and which they haven't been trained in. You know, they know what they don't know. The best police officers, and we've got some in our own congregation, have a kind of patience and almost a firm gentleness. They know how to work with people well. They also know that they don't have every single exact legal rule memorized. They have to, in the moment, sometimes do the best that they can do. Those are the best officers. They know what they don't know. It's the least competent people who can't admit fault, who think they have the answers, who can't be challenged, and they don't know they're wrong. Now, there's also another, this is kind of a really timely right now, but this is the modern litmus test for racism. I was having a conversation with Beth and her dad this week. We were backpacking in Appalachia, and we were having a conversation about how the word racist has changed from the 1960s, that we're talking more now about systemic racism. And for some people, they're still thinking that, you just have to be a racist person, and that's the word. But today, that word really talks more about the systems that give some advantages to some people and no advantages to other people. And so so this is really the litmus test today. Is the white folks who are the most informed about race in America are the first people to say, yeah, I have racist biases in my own life that I have to fight, and I am complicit in racist systems. They're the first people to volunteer that. And you think, well, why would someone be so eager to volunteer that? It's because they're not afraid of admitting fault, and they're admitting their part in something that's bad. And yet the people who are the least educated in the dynamics of modern race are the most defensive, the most likely to deny it. You see the same thing happening here. And it's not just this. I'm not trying to make a modern political point here. Another example is with AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. Those who are successful through the program are those who realize their shortcomings. In the AA Big Book, there's this quote, and boy, it just strikes to the heart here, and maybe it will for you too, but here's the quote. It says this: "Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program." And then here's the catch: "Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves." And then they continue, "Such people are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands" what? Rigorous honesty. This is like understanding that you might be wrong, that you've made mistakes, that you have faults. This is again and again. Over and over, it's the most dedicated, it's the most committed, it's the most educated, it's the most informed, it's the most competent people who can admit when they're wrong. What all of these have in common is that the realization, the realization that you could be wrong is not a flaw of the weak, but a strength of the best. The realization that you could be wrong is not a flaw of the weak, but a strength of the best. And this carries over into the Christian faith as well. The holiest men and women that I know, and probably that you know, who walk more closely with Christ than I'll ever walk, they're the first people to admit that they're sinners, that they fall short, that they make mistakes, that they're not perfect. And it's the people who are often far from God who deny that they need any help. And I've talked about all of this, all of these studies, all of these different examples, just to set the groundwork for our passage today from Paul. And this is, our passage actually picks up in the second chapter of Romans. And it's called Romans just because it's this letter that he wrote to Rome. Sometimes when we pick up the Bible, we don't remember that this is actually information that Paul wrote as a letter to people in the first century. And our passage picks up in chapter 2, but Paul actually in chapter 1, just giving you a little bit of a background here, Paul does this funny thing where he has some pleasantries, and then he just dives in to complaining about the world today. And I don't have it up here, but I want to read this to you real quick. At the end of chapter 1, Paul ends with this passage just talking about how bad things are. And there's some fundamentalist Christians that love Romans chapter 1 because it sounds like Paul's just talking about how evil people have gotten. I mean, he talks about unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, mean-spiritedness. He just goes on and on and on about how people have lost their way. And then he even ends the chapter by saying, these people, they are without understanding, they're disloyal, they're without affection, they're without mercy, and though they know God's decision that those who persist in such practices deserve death, they not only keep doing these things, but they also approve of others who practice them. It's like the ultimate, can you believe the world today? Now, a lot of people love this, and they love buying into this mentality, how bad things have gotten, how evil people are. You've probably had these conversations. I know I have. And it's actually a trap. It's a trap that Paul is using to draw in these readers, because look at how chapter 2 starts. He just hits them with this. And so I'm going to break down this passage a little bit. So here it is. And think about this. Remember, he's just complained about how bad everything is and everyone is. And then he hits this. So every single one of who? You who judge others is without any excuse. He just comes out of left field. They're all like, yeah, people are terrible. And he's like, but you are the ones without excuse. And this would be shocking to read for these first hearers. And then he continues, you condemn yourself. You condemn yourself. God doesn't condemn you. You condemn yourself when? Not when you do bad things, when you judge another person, because the one who is judging is doing the same things. He says, really, you're perfect? You have the ability? You don't have any flaws? You don't have any mistakes? You're perfectly entitled to go and judge the world for what they're doing? And this would be, just think, again, he's drawn in this crowd, these first hearers, and he says, oh, all those people? No, it's you who I have a problem with. It's you who need to be worried. This is entirely a switch. Paul's not worried about what everyone else out there is doing. He's actually pointing the finger at the Christian community. He says, excuse me, you're really all those people are who you're spending your time judging? What about you? All right, and then he continues, verse 2. We know that God's judgment agrees with the truth, and his judgment is against those who do these kinds of things. This is his fancy way of saying that God isn't biased. So all of us don't know when we're right or wrong. You know who knows when they're right? Is God. God knows. God's judgment agrees with the truth. Truth, like completely and wholly, God knows what's true and what's not true. There's no, God's not unsure when God's not right. Right? God actually sees things objectively and clearly as they are, okay? And the judgment is against those who do these kinds of things. All right, verse 3, it goes on. If you judge those who do these kinds of things while you do the same things yourself, think about this. Do you believe that you will escape God's judgment? Now, this sometimes can be a verse that's used from Christians who just love hammering this home. Again, this is the kind of stuff that people say to other people. Oh, you want to escape God's judgment? Well, Paul's saying it in this way. Do you really think that you get special treatment? That's what he's saying here. Do you think that you're allowed to get grace, that you can make mistakes, that you aren't that right, that God will treat you differently than all these other people, that you're judging so easily? And then verse 4. He says, or do you have contempt for the riches? I love this language here. Contempt for the riches of God's generosity, tolerance, and patience. So let's unpack that for a second. Do you have contempt? It's basically saying, are you just taking for granted? Are you looking a gift horse in the mouth? Do you think that God's grace is just so cheap or so easy or so kind of casual in your life that you don't have to treat it as if it's a gift? Like, do you just think that God's grace and God's kindness and God's patience with you is just something that's not that big of a deal to you? I mean, do you treat it with contempt? Do you think it's so little that you don't actually try to live or change your life? Don't you realize that God's kindness is supposed to lead you to change your heart and life? Like he's saying to these Christians, listen, you've received grace and you've received kindness and you've received patience from God. And then you go and judge other people. Don't you realize that you receive all those things just so that you can change? Just so that you are on a growth path? You know, what happens in the world today is that sometimes we look at someone else's life and what's ironic is sometimes people believe stuff that we used to believe. Like you used to be that same person. You used to have those beliefs. You used to have those challenges. And just because you've overcome them, all of a sudden you look at someone with those same issues, who have the same beliefs, the same thoughts, and you think, oh, I can't believe they would think something like that. When you used to think the same thing. We very rarely offer people the grace that we so lovingly receive, don't we? And I just wanted to unpack that today because Paul is trying to tell these Christians to stop thinking you're so right. To stop thinking that you're so right. Now, certain churches have run with this, and they've made it bad in an opposite way. You know, calling people sinners, demanding they repent, screaming from the street corners. But that's not where Paul's coming from. Paul's talking to the Christians. Paul's not writing this letter to everyone else in Rome. He's writing it to the Jesus followers in Rome. He wants to help them know, he wants to help them stay humble. He wants to help them realize that they're wrong and to stay there, to live in that place, to realize that you might be wrong. Because admitting your failure, your shortcomings, your mistakes, and your sins is not a flaw of the weak, but a strength of the best. Understanding that you have flaws, that you might not be right, that to be able to do this is not a flaw of the weak, but a strength of the best. And we see this over and over in every field. And I want to pivot for just a second because it's Father's Day. And I feel like men especially have, I don't know if it's a cultural thing, surely it's not a genetic thing, but we just live in a world that promotes this attitude that we have to be right, that we can't apologize, that's a sign of weakness, that admitting fault will make people disrespect you or not respect you as much. And the reality is that you might have a great dad or have had a great dad or be a great dad, but you might not have had a great dad. And I know that's my story. This is a hard day for some of us that didn't have those father figures in our lives or who struggle with fatherhood. And one of the last conversations I ever had with my dad, he passed away in 2013. One of the last conversations I ever had with him was when I went down to Miami. He lived in Miami, and he had actually, I think, called me one day out of the blue, and I hadn't talked to him for 10 years. And he told me that he was sick and he didn't have a lot of time left. And so I drove down to Miami, and I spent a few hours with him and caught up with him. And, you know, this guy he had been gone most of my childhood. I lived with him for a year in high school, and my stepmom didn't like me, and so he just sent me away. He said, "You're going back to your mom for the summer," and then I never came back. Like this was the kind of relationship I had with my dad. And he looked at me, he had this conversation with me, and all I wanted was for him to say, you know, I wish I had done better. You know, I'm sorry. All I wanted in that moment, the one thing I would have wished for that my dad could have given me was just for him to say, I'm sorry, and I wish I had done better. But in this last really moments that I got to spend with him, what I got was, well, your mom did a better job raising you than I ever could have. You know, the last thing I got from my dad was an excuse. Was an excuse for things that he probably knew were wrong. And the reality is maybe he didn't really think it was wrong. Maybe it was just a way that he was processing it all. Maybe he actually believed that. But I'll tell you what, if my dad had been able to say to me, I was wrong, and I'm sorry for those years and for the way I handled them, I would have had more respect for that man despite all of the mistakes that he had made, despite all of the lack of relationship that we had had. If he had just been the kind of guy who could admit fault, I'd be telling a different story about him right now. And yet somehow he got, and so many of us get this mentality that admitting fault is a weakness. And yet, when it comes to living a life of peace, of being a person at peace, if you can't take any ownership or blame for faults, shortcomings, mistakes in your life, you will never be able to have true peace with people in your life. Your relationships will always fall short of what they could be. This isn't just a trite piece of advice from 2,000 years ago. There is something in human beings that keeps us from wanting to be wrong. And yet, being wrong might be the first step towards a different kind of life for you and I, and a different kind of peace than we've known up till now. And I share that because you might have some little ones at home, or you might have those kids in your life still. And you might be able to have a conversation here that sets a tone for your sons or daughters, that shows what true strength is, that could make a difference in their lives because they've got a dad who's willing to actually be real with them and be real with their own faults. See, being someone who's willing to be wrong is actually something that a strong person does. And so, on this Father's Day, we remember Paul, who probably didn't have any children, and how his advice wasn't to have this yoga-like peace. It's not going to have a peace that you feel when you get a massage or go in the hot tub. It won't get you the kind of peace that you get when you go on a vacation. The peace that Paul wants Christians to have is the peace that eventually comes when you're honest with you, when you're honest with God, when you're honest with everyone else. Would you pray with me? God, we are people who are flawed. We're people who are broken. Sometimes in churches, United Methodist churches or mainline Protestant churches, we try to stay away from words like sin. We stay away from words like sinner. And yet, God, there might be some freedom for us today if we could be people who admit that we make mistakes, that we can be wrong. And so, God, help us as a church, help us as a community, be people who lead with the words, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I'll grow, I'll change, I'll work from this. Help us be people who realize where we actually are. Help us be people who can face the truth of who we are, where we are, so that you can actually and truly grow in us and help us find some grace and love. God, thank you for loving us, and thank you for this day gathering together. And we just ask you to be in our church, be in this world, and help us model what it looks like to be truly strong. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
I invite you to stand with us as we sing.
God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time, with no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of the breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship so alive, I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises so alive. God of your promise, you don't speak in vain, no syllable empty your voice. For once you have spoken, all nature and science follow the sound of your voice. And as you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. That all reveals your nature so alive. I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of your grace. Creation still obeys you so alive. So alive. God of salvation, you chased down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100
Thank you, Amber and the band, and it's good to be in this space again with you guys. And thank you all for helping us test out this service today, and thank you for joining us online. Before you go, I want to remind you that next week we are opening up the space where we only have so many chairs in here with social distancing, so we ask that you please register online, and if that's a little challenging for you, feel free to call the office if you want that more analog reservation system, and we'll help you out. But next week, we're also going to have our new associate pastor, Andrew, here helping us with worship. And I'm so excited to have him around. But he'll also be walking around our movie night, too, this Saturday. So I hope you'll sign up and join us for our drive-in. It'll be great to see you all in person. We also, you may notice that there's no time of offering in this service. And so we're grateful for those of you who give online, who set up recurring giving. And we're grateful to all of you. There's an offering basket in the back if you want to leave your gift and practice that spiritual discipline. You're welcome to leave that in the back. And so I invite you now to bow your heads for this benediction. So go in peace, knowing that you go with a God who isn't looking for you to be perfect, but looking for you to grow. And so may you leave this place with the humility of somebody and the spirit of somebody who is a student still today. Go in peace. Amen. And see you next week, friends. Hold on, I got to make sure we're saying goodbye here. So I'll see you guys next week.